Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio and our lunchtime talk for today. These talks are every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and also live online. So whether you're in Bristol or further away, you can join in the conversation. My name's Jo Lansdowne. I'm executive producer of Pervasive Media Studio. I'm a 40-year-old white woman with short blonde hair, a white shirt, and some slightly vampish lipstick today. Every Friday we throw open the doors of Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time here with us to listen to a talk and also to hot desk alongside our residents if you'd like to. That's from 10 to 5 every Friday. So an especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio. If this is the first time that you're engaging with us in the building or online, welcome. This next bit's particularly for you. I'm going to talk a bit about what Pervasive Media Studio is. So we are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We are a partnership between Watershed, where we are now, University of the West of England and the University of Bristol, with funding from Arts Council England. So we offer studio space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities to a community of residents here. And we particularly hope to be a place for people to take risks with early ideas and to collaborate with each other. So a quick bit of housekeeping. Feel free to move around if you'd like to. We've got a couple of beanbags here at the front if that's more comfortable for you. You can make a cup of tea or grab a glass of water in the kitchen at the back there. Don't use the microwave if that's okay. It interferes with our induction loop. There's a quiet space just over here through the door if you need to take a break at any point. And fire exits at either end of the studio over there, and one of the team will lead you towards them if we need to. There's accessible toilets and baby change in the corridor just by the kitchen. So there will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk. If you're watching online, you can put your questions in the chat at any point and someone in the room will pick them up for you. If you're in the building, you can raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone. Just a heads up, it doesn't amplify your voice, which can feel a bit strange, but it enables the people who are online to hear you. So please do make sure that you use it. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, PM Studio UK on Twitter, Pervasive Media Studio, at mastodon.social on Mastodon, at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. So that's that bit done. I'm delighted to introduce you to Jill Wildman and Tony Bhajam. Both of whom are part of the Watershed team and the Pervasive Media Studio community, who are going to talk to you a little bit about some work that they've been doing to develop an inclusive framework for change. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thanks so much. We know that these talks are usually presentation talks, and so we thought we'd change it up a bit, didn't we?
Absolutely.
And this is going to be more of a conversation. So I've got some questions, and Tony's got a couple of questions for me, and we're going to just basically talk about the work. Tony, do you want to introduce yourself a little?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name's Tony. I'm one of the producers here in the studio. I've spent the last couple of years working on a programme called Bristol and Bath Creative R&D. And just for those of you who haven't heard of it, Bristol and Bath was a partnership between Watershed and all 4 of the local universities. That's UE, University of Bristol, University of Bath and Bath Spa. It was an experiment in how we nurture community. What does it take to build a network and a community of people around creative technology to strengthen that sector within Bristol and Bath, with thought given to how you marry up university research with people trying stuff on the ground, and how you bring those things together, and how you bring prototyping processes into that mix, and kind of what it takes to generate a network and a community out of that kind of space. My role within that was around inclusion. Obviously, we'll come and talk about that a little bit today. But out of that work came an inclusion framework, and it came out of a bunch of conversations, work with Jill and other colleagues and a part of the wider team. But just to give you a little bit of background on where we're on. Jill.
So my name's Jill Wildman. I'm a designer. I'm also a studio resident. I run a company called Plots, which was involved in this project, but I also run another one called Upstarter. And so I'm going to kick off with some questions, and then we'll take yours. So if anything comes up for you, if you want to hold it, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So first, Tony, can you tell us about how you got to Watershed and why you're an inclusion producer?
So when we were having to think about these questions, I was like, I don't know, why am I in anything at all ever? Existential crisis is all over the place. But actually, it's a useful, like, an existential crisis is a useful starting point for this, because actually stepping into the role of being an inclusion producer was something that I questioned, and I questioned whether I was the person for that role. It was never a role that I'd had in that kind of focused way before now. Before this, I worked in youth engagement for a long time, building projects and programs for young people in Birmingham. I'll talk about that at length to you another time. But actually, my experience was in thinking about resources that we had to hand and the types of the people and the communities that we were trying to build towards with those resources, and trying to understand what an engagement opportunity that works on both sides of that was. And I think that might be what I think inclusion is. So, yeah, that was my starting point, and that was what brought me to this. And also, PM Studio had been my organisational crush for a very long time as well. So.
Brilliant. And of course, your work naturally builds on the work of other people that have been here, also exploring inclusion for Watershed.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, I can. I have to start any conversation about any of the work that I did here with the wonderful groundwork laid by Zara Ash Harper, who's in the inclusion producer role before me. I did a lot of the hard work of kind of shifting focus towards inclusion and helping inclusion be a centralised part of this project. And also the wider team had done a bunch of work before I got here. Bristol and Bath had been happening for about a year before I started, so I'm not laying any claim to starting inclusion in this programme or anything like that. Even the fact that the inclusion producer role existed was a wonderful testament to the team that came in before me.
And then there was also the work by Jazlyn Pinckey.
Yes, of course,
well.
yes, yeah. So Jazlyn was our other collaborator on this piece of work, who also started in an inclusion producer role in a sister partner project to this called the Southwest Creative Technology Network. And it was really great to have her enroll at the same time, thinking about slightly different parts of inclusion, because the remit within that project was a little bit different to mine, but being able to compare and contrast our approaches and help with that imposter syndrome stuff as well. So it's really great.
And it feels like that was a moment when suddenly everyone was looking at inclusion.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Wow, I mean, so I love telling the story of the way the day that I decided to take this job was the day. Here's a little bit of life story, everybody. I'm really bad at making decisions, right? And I got offered another job at the same time as this one, and I was finding it really difficult to work out what it was I was going to do. And I was asking the universe for a sign. I'm not that kind of university fatey, signy sort of person, but turned Channel 4 News on, and they were dumping Colston in the harbour, and Jon Snow was out there, or someone was out there, and Watershed was in the background, and this job was all about inclusion, and they were throwing slaver in the harbour, and it was all right then, I will go to Bristol and I'll go and do the inclusion producer role. Exactly, yeah. I haven't looked back since, but I think it's really great, like, it speaks really well to the high stakes of the moment, and actually it was a moment in which loads of organisations across a bunch of sectors were making a whole bunch of really big statements and pledges towards what equity means and what anti-racism means, and kind of really nailing colours to the mast. And it was a really interesting point to come along and hopefully build some accountability into those processes. I was really excited for that element of it.
Because it certainly felt like that was the time when the really hard work started. Because you could write a manifesto, you could do stuff, but actually to look at systems and processes and learn the difficult things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really
I think what it meant. Actually, to some language which Zara used to use within Bristol and Bath Creative R&D, which is this idea of radical inclusion. And I thought it was a really interesting choice of language in that space, and especially in that moment in time, because what I thought being radical meant was something different to what I saw in the programme, and kind of absolutely tearing down statues and throwing them in the harbour felt like a radical thing. But I was like, is this radical work? But me and Zara got to chatting about it after quite a long time and being enrolled. Actually, I got to chat to her and be like, what led you to that kind of language? And actually, she really wonderfully explained to me around the way that the programme was developed with inclusion fellows. So there's people in the programme who were funded just to come and have a think about inclusive practice within creative tech. So that was a radical, opportunities didn't exist before, roles like mine didn't exist before. And that was before the murder of George Floyd and before kind of the last round of Black Lives Matter protests and the removal of the statue and things like that. So kind of it all just sharply came into focus as people were talking about inclusion. We were at a spot because of some of the groundwork laid by the team and by the wider partnership to really engage with that conversation really head on. So it was a really exciting time to come to the work, I think.
Great. So we're a couple of years later down the line. Have we sorted it?
I don't think we're ever going to sort it, are we? I think, I think talking about solving it suggests that there's an end point to this work, and I don't think there ever is. In the same way that what Radical was shifted from, you know, creating these spaces and these roles and these funded opportunities to have a think about what inclusion means. And I don't say that in a reductive way. I think there's a real power in the way that some of these opportunities are developed without necessarily really defined outputs and outcomes and kind of being able to point at stuff, but the opportunity to have a think. But then the stakes changed and what people's emphasis was changed. So that will keep changing again. So what feels radical today won't feel radical tomorrow. And what feels really risky and adventurous now as a kind of take a chance on this process will become standard process. And kind of there's always going to be space. Unfortunately, the systems that we live in means there will always be people that are not getting equity out of processes, I think.
And it's also seems to be one of those areas where things expand. You discover something and then it expands into a whole range of other aspects that you then have to look at and attend to, which is one of the reasons it's so fascinating.
Yeah, so I think it's a real opportunity. I know, like, it can feel really overwhelming, so that because there's so much to be done and there's so many bits of it, and it's stuff that's gone on to inform some of the work that we've done together, actually, of helping people to stop being overwhelmed by the hugeness of it and think about it in terms of what they can do now and what they can do later, and the instances and the moments that they can create change in is definitely the language that we started using and started building towards, I think, as well. So there's joy to be had in it.
So tell us about the lead up to producing the framework.
Yes,
what did you do when you got here? And then how did that inform the framework?
Well, I panicked for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then once
New job, big remit.
Yes, yeah. I think, again, like it's testament to the way that the role was created and the way that the team was built, that inclusion was a large part of the programme, but actually I had a really gloriously broad remit in terms of there were no KPIs against it. And I had a bit of a budget to play with, and I had the space and time to try out some stuff, and that's a really powerful crossing of things and resources to have available to you to be able to try out new stuff and try out new things. My practice from before working here had taught me that the way to try and create a kind of inclusion program is to understand where you're doing really well and where you're not doing so well, and then think about how you replicate the things that you are doing well in the spaces that you're not doing well. And that translated into a piece of work called State of Play, which was essentially a demographic survey of the program, really broadly. So that was people that we were funding through research and prototype development, but then also the staff team, the delivery team, the senior team, like the management team, and also the exec team as well on top of that. To really kind of try and build a picture of who we were across a bunch of different characteristics. So, you know, age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, all of those sorts of things in there. But as ever, nothing is ever simple and easy. I was, at the time that I was doing that, doing some really great work with Layla Barron, the head of data at Watershed, and Jazlyn Pinckey, who was the inclusion producer on Swapton, and Luke Emery at the time, who was our studio lead at the time as well, who were all thinking about understanding a group of people or a community of people, whether that be the studio community or whether it be the staff at Watershed or the community within Bristol and Bath R&D, to try and understand them better, to try and understand what needed to change in our offer to serve the people that weren't in that space, I think is a thing that we were aiming for a little bit. But we came across the work of Aubrey Blanche. I'm always gonna name check Aubrey Blanche wherever I go, and kind of her work around this idea of not thinking about benchmarks, but more about what balance is. And it's something that we have carried over into the practice at Watershed now. So Watershed does a staff survey every year, but we resist the idea of benchmarking. When I say benchmarking, I mean against the demographics of the city. So kind of, if Bristol's got 5% of this community, that should be represented in here, but it comes back to that idea of inclusion being solved, and I don't think that it's solvable. And if you start working in that kind of a way, that you limit yourself, you limit the possibilities of what you're willing to try and do and change and who you're trying to be inclusive of. I think it can be limiting instead. So we threw all of that work out of the window. Or didn't throw it out the window, let me try again. We learned we generated the learnings, and there were gaps within it, but then we got to thinking about, well, okay, there are gaps here. How would you build into those? What are the resources that we can provide for people that maybe aren't as well represented as others in this program? Which led to an even bigger question then of kind of, all right, so where can I create change in this program? Where does change come from? Became my first kind of central question in some of this work.
And that came through in the way, for example, things got changed, such as awards.
Yes.
And the kind of programs and some of the awards like Trailblazer.
Yeah. So Trailblazer is it's one of my favourite bits of work, and that came out of Bristol and Bath R&D, whereas it wasn't my piece of work, it was a piece of work that we did as a team, but it grew out of some conversations that had been circulating before I started, but I was definitely part of them when they came up around, well, there's this idea that we could have gone and built an outreach program, and we could have done some really great VR workshops with some young people in some bit of the city and got people really excited for the work that was happening here. But actually the opportunities that we developed and the opportunities that were available were pretty big opportunities. To my mind, could be quite intimidating opportunities. We're talking like 20, 30, up to like 50, 60K sometimes in terms of a funding opportunity, which if you're in the right space for it and you're ready for it, that's an amazing investment, and especially in the lovely loose way in which we were willing to look at what outputs were and kind of the way that it was designed to create that space to think. But also, if you're somebody that's new to the technology, or if you're new to this kind of this field, are you going to be ready for that level of funding and that level of responsibility that comes with that funding and things as well? And it got me to questioning kind of, well, could we give out smaller pots of money? Does the next, so Bristol and Bath was organised into what we call Pathfinders, so it's kind of themes in technology and things like that. In the next Pathfinder, could the awards be smaller? But we'd already started kind of there were things that we'd said that we would do to the funder, and there were things that the aims of the program were around bigger pieces of work, and they were around this kind of largeness. And actually, we didn't have the power to change those things. And I say that not as a criticism or as a negative of me to the program. We collectively didn't necessarily have the power to change that, but we could start thinking about where else change could come from and what else we could do in that sort of a space, which is where I think Trailblazer was a real success. So Trailblazer was a really reflective and really responsive funding call out. It was ongoing, it was outside. Yes, yeah. It had a lot less of those hoops to jump through. It's about removal of hoops, and kind of what it would fund was different, a much smaller pot of money as well. Really anecdotally, I think it was the most diverse cohort of people that we had in the whole program existed, and I say that without any actual numbers data to back it up, so please don't question it too hard.
Brilliant.
But yeah, kind of a really great example of early thinking around the power that we have to create change, and kind of how we can apply our resources as long as we keep who we're trying to do things for at the heart of what we're trying to do, and keep interrogating, questioning that, which is a lovely bit of work to start with.
So we're going to take a moment to ask you something, because it's also, this framework is about thinking through what you do within your work. So I'm going to ask you to think for a moment about what might you do in your work, your situation, your service, the things that you do. What might you be able to do from what you know that might include, might increase inclusion where you are? And I just want you to take a moment, and everyone at home as well, please, just have a think about where, in all the things you do, might you do something? And I want you to hold that thought for a moment, because we're gonna ask you to cook it up a little bit with us. But just to take that idea right now, where might it occur? Tony, got some suggestions where people might think?
So, to think about the logic of the framework is about thinking about kind of what are the moments in your processes where you can start to think where people engage with your work, and kind of what are the instances in there. Is it in your application processes, or does it come later on in the events that you're hosting? Or is it about the way that you select? Is it about your application processes and things like that? So have you got any ideas to add to that, Jill?
But also maybe how you make decisions, or who your suppliers, who you might work with. There could be all kinds of ways you could think about inclusion right across the board of what you do?
I find this a really useful way to break this down. Sometimes the inclusion, we did some action research projects and we themed them into spaces, governance and communities. And I think it's a really useful lens to start thinking about the different elements and spaces within your projects where you can try and increase inclusive practice.
So, what's in the toolkit?
What's in the toolkit? Firstly, go and have a look and find out. Secondly, a bunch of questions. And I think we really purposefully went with questions and not answers.
Just like this?
Yes, yeah. I think
so to help you unpack, to help you think, to help you work your own way through.
Questions, provocations and inspirations from some of the research which we supported and collaborated, people that we collaborated with as our researchers for it. We were really conscious of going with questions and not actions, because I think sometimes if you start with an action, it's really quickly to say no to something, and actually if you go to somebody with an action that doesn't feel like the right action for them, that it might disempower them to feel like they can create change, but also it can also shut them off from the possibilities of the other things that you're saying as well. Once something doesn't feel right, a bunch of other things don't feel right as well. And I think starting with, well, these are the questions that we asked to get to where we wanted to go. What questions, how are these questions useful to you? How might you respond to them within the context that you're working in? I thought was a really useful way to start.
Absolutely. So why do you start, why does it start with intentions?
I think you have to have a really clear idea of what it is that you're trying to do before you can start answering it. I mean, I know that we talked a lot about we talk about audiences, and audiences being a really broad idea of the person that you're trying to engage with. And we talked a lot about whether it's audiences first or intentions first, and actually do you start, and you could flip them around, you could do it the other way of going, here is a group of people that I'm trying to support and advocate for, here is what they might need from the resources I've got. You could do it that way around, but I guess we had a really strong sense of what we were trying to do. I came into a program that was already running and already had a bunch of things that it wanted to see as successes. So it was the other way around of, here's what we're trying to do, here's who we could do this for. And I think it's a really, again, to go back to one of the massive statements that people made and kind of all the pledges that took place and things like that. We've got a really strong sense of what we're saying we're doing. And to say, all right, this is what we're doing, this is who we want to do it for. You have to marry those things up either way around. I think it works quite nicely.
So back when the framework work started, Tony and Jazz invited me in as a tool designer and sort of process head to help think about how we might express and explain this kind of thinking that was really nascent at the time, wasn't it? You were dealing with work in the everyday work of Watershed, but you were also trying to nail down what is this that's new and that could be offered. And that particular point about where do you start, what's the starting point for anybody when this stuff can explode into lots of facets. It was really, really interesting that we did lots of what would you call it? Like very constructive arguing until we wrestled something to the ground, and then felt like it was robust enough for us to be able to then take it forward. So that particular issue as well about audiences first or intention first, that was a real wrestling point, which was great because this work really needs that kind of effort to get it right. So let's give you another question. If you've thought about what you want to do, so in that sense, set your intention. The second question is, who are you doing this for? So I'd love you to sort of spend a few seconds just having a think about who would benefit from this action that you're doing, and what do you know about them in order to do that? So, as the question says, who are you thinking about when you have this project, this action in mind? And who's the audience for it? And why were audiences important?
So I think I really like the idea of it being the phrase audience, and I know we talked a lot about whether audience is the right word for it. It doesn't always land with people.
No, exactly.
But I think an audience to me is someone, if you're trying to present or offer or show something to someone, I think it's that element of demonstration, actually. And it comes back to that idea of you've only got a few opportunities to really demonstrate your values. All of the things that you say in your big statements, actually, your opportunity to demonstrate those in your processes are really slim. There's not many of them. So you've got to really think about the audience. It is how you're demonstrating and showing and performing your values to somebody. I think maybe it is more of a theatre-related analogy than I realised.
But you can substitute whatever word works for you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the idea. So one of the terms that you use really early on, which I know as a designer from service design, is the word touch points. Can you tell me why that was so important and why you used it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so much of the work that I do and the inclusion work generally tends to be really, call it chin strokey stuff, really ethereal stuff, and it can feel really intangible, really deeply like theoretical stuff, which doesn't ever land in real action. That's why I talk about demonstrating your values to people in the moments that can happen in. They're the tangible moments, the moments that you can touch them, and that's why we kind of hit on that little bit of language. But it's part of that process of absolutely taking your huge processes and all the big ideas and all the big things that you're trying to achieve and funneling them into individual instances and things like that. But you should be able to touch them in your process. I really liked it. I thought it resonated really well. And you get a nice picture out of it.
Yeah, and it feels like it really lands the idea because, you know, the experience of sitting in the chair is the result of the intention around making the chair and making the chair fit you, for example, put it into a product form. Or the greeting at the door, you know, by somebody is the embodiment of the intentions of the service or the community. So landing this work in terms of touch points is really critical, because whatever you're thinking, if it doesn't hit the people in that way that you intend, then it's not working. So back to you. Think about where your audience, customers, clients, whoever are the people you're talking about, where do they touch your work or your service or your community? Just like to take a few seconds to have a
Well, you check your WhatsApp, Joe, yeah.
I'm not checking my WhatsApp, I'm looking at my script.
Sure.
But also the WhatsApp's really, really interesting. We should have a Twitter back channel for this, I think. So yeah, think about what that touch point might be. Is it like the greeting? Is it the interaction with you? Is it the documents, the reports, the papers, the receipts? Thinking about what that touch point might mean and how you might work with it is a really interesting way of thinking. There's another term that is also used by designers, but I also heard someone else in anti-racism training the other day use, which is also the notion of moments of truth.
My face lit up when I heard that.
Yeah,
I was like, oh, I wish I'd come up with that one. I think it speaks to the high stakes nature of what this work is, and I think I try my hardest in this role to not beat people over the head with inclusion and make it that really big series. The framework is an exercise actually in trying to make it more manageable and make it to make it feel less scary and intense. But Moments of Truth speaks really well to the fact that actually the moments and there's instances that you create are moments of truth in that kind of, either you're going to demonstrate your values to someone or you're not, and they're going to engage and see what you're trying to do, or they're not, and you're going to end up building a relationship with that person, or you're not. And I think it speaks to that really well. I wish we'd thought of it.
Well, it's used and it's really great. It's out there and it's really, it's nice to bring that into the work that we all do, that we might think about. Is that, does that work actually, produce the kind of intended effect for us? And in the moments of truth, whether it's doing it or not is really, really critical. So, right at the heart of the framework is this notion of power, capacity and resource, or capacity, resource and power.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. As you can see, I'm a big fan of it. It grew out of, so all of those experiments that, if I started off with that question of where change can come from, then the next bit that came out of that was, well, then what do you need to make the change that you're trying to make? And if it was that we couldn't if we couldn't change the size and the scale of some of the pots of money that we were giving out, well, then we had to start thinking about what else we could change in that kind of a space. And when we were trying to consider bridging that gap between those, those early VR workshops and then a 50K to run a prototype and that middle ground in it, we'd started talking about things like doing developmental fellowships. What would it take to put somebody on that journey? And we got really close to doing that piece of work as well. Unfortunately, we didn't have the capacity as a team for that piece of work at the time, and really got me to thinking about what the levers are that you need to be able to pull when you're trying to make change in a big space or in a little space, and kind of your power within a process and our collective power within a process to create change as well. And this was the distillation of that. I campaigned really hard to be allowed to call it the stool of change, but we got knocked back of kind of this idea of if you remove one of the legs of this stool of the change that you're trying to create, that it's going to fall over, and that if you don't have the power for this, can you have the power for that? But also in the reckoning then of your capacity, resource and power, it really leaves it feeds into this idea that I call it asset-based inclusion. Start with what you've got and build off the back of that. There's another phrase that I use: if you can't do X, can you do Y instead? Often it can feel in the same way that benchmarks and solving it limits the conversation. You go into a space and you suggest an idea and the answer will be, oh, we can't afford that. And it stops the conversation dead, or, oh, well, we haven't got the time for that. And then that stops the conversation dead. And actually, what that is an invitation to go, we haven't got the time for that, but, or we haven't got the power to do this, however, and it's the next bit. It's okay, so if you can't do this, how do you do that next bit of it? And it's that challenge, and that's why the framework is built around a series of questions as opposed to being a directory of actions that you can take. Because it doesn't leave anywhere to hide. There's no excuses then if you've been able to mitigate for all of those kinds of things. Joe, you've got me talking about power. You literally wrote the book on power. Do you want to?
Well, I wouldn't claim that, but it's something that's always fascinated me because it's the kind of thing that no one talks about. Everybody, we all operate with power. We either have it or we don't, or sometimes we give it away. But the nature of power in either how we do our work or how we get our work and how we exist is really, 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 really affects us. And yet there aren't any sort of good guides to it. So I was digging around in a PhD looking at it, and that's one of the reasons why we were talking about it so much. But there's some amazing people like Susan Allain. There's that fantastic quote by Tony Benn. I don't know if you know it, but it's I had to write it down just to get it a little bit more correct. But he said, what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And then how do we get rid of you? And it's a really lovely piece to sort of illustrate how power can actually really be mishandled. But finding better ways of articulating power is a real interest of mine, as is making tools and making things that help open up access of ideas and stuff to everybody. And there's also this sort of notion, I saw that a talk by Angela Saini the other day, where she was talking about how particular communities have this idea of naturalistic claims to power and how that also needs to be questioned and challenged. So there's some really great people that are thinking about this stuff now, and it's really worth looking at. But back to you, when it comes to the thing you're thinking about, the framework will work in a way that helps you think about what's your capacity for doing this. Do you have any time? Do you have any power to make it happen? And also, do you have any resources by which you can make it happen? And equally, with all of those three, it's what you haven't got. How would you go about getting it? What do you need? So one of the things that's come out of this is also thinking about new models of how we think about this stuff. Yeah, power's a really lovely, tricksy, interesting space. So you also did some research around this. You commissioned some research with a bunch of new people.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so as part of Bristol Bath Creative, before the framework was developed and came out, we collaborated with a bunch of different people on a program called Test and Reflect, which was an opportunity for people working in engagement-focused projects across a few different sectors to think about what inclusive practice means to them and to the communities and the people that they're working with, to test out a new idea or a new thought not necessarily to the world, but possibly to them, to understand what works for them and what doesn't work for them, and for the people that they're trying to do it for. And then Reflect was an opportunity, an invite to people to reflect on experiences that they had, or spaces that they've been in, or processes that they've been through, both good and bad, to reflect on what made them good or what made them bad, in the hope that we could learn from those kinds of things as well. It was a really interesting piece of work because it was mega varied. Like you had people that were running small consultancies around inclusion, thinking about care in the workplace, and you had people that had been through application processes, and maybe they weren't the best processes that they'd been involved in, and they'd been quite upset by them, and they wanted to reflect on what it was and the power dynamics in those situations, which made that sort of stuff happen. You had other people that were bringing together quite disparate groups, people with very specific, very differing needs, to try and create things together, and kind of understanding what the dynamics were in that kind of a space, and how do you bring in people from the outside, and how do you grow to bring it back to the ideas of Bristol and Bath Creative R&D, how do you grow and nurture a community, what does it take to do that, and a bunch of people asking stuff in different spaces. I guess it really helped to crystallise the idea that, so I've got this half a thought, which is you might build 10 different actions for 10 different people, say, different communities, but it's the questions that you ask to build those actions that I think are important. The actions that you take are secondary to the motivators and the things that the design process that you took to get to those actions in that space. And I find it difficult to explain out to people, but I think the actions are all the same. If you've asked the same questions together, they might look really different, but the motivators for those spaces, I think, are the same ones. I don't know if that makes sense. Ask me a question about it later and I'll explain it better.
So we've got your experience of trying to achieve change and like realising that's bounded in certain ways. So there's me and Jazz and you, and we're doing this robust disagreement in a process, and then we're prototyping it every phase of the way, basically trying to lay out a way of thinking, but that also folds in that fresh research. Because we've got people coming in and doing new things with us. And it made for a really sort of interesting cocktail of a method of producing a toolkit like this, but then also binding people into that process. So this is an example of sort of a midpoint prototype where we've got very distinct stages, but we've also started to invite the researchers in to sort of give it a kick. And then also we run a couple of sessions here, but then also started to use some of the thinking from the research to turn them into very sort of unique moments that might help us think further about inclusion across the new material that was coming from the research. And then what came out of this was a bunch of cards, which you'll also see on the website, which are downloadable and easily produced, but that deal with things like the messy human stuff, that deal with specific issues of power. And as you can see, this work is very collaborative and very sort of iterative in the way that we've tried lots of ways of doing it, but a total joy to do. And then we prototyped a few workshops, didn't we? Yeah. We did some, a micro one at a conference, a big day-long one with a massive team. And so we've tried lots of ways of getting it out there just to see, does it work in these different contexts?
Well, do these questions work for people?
Yeah, and do the questions actually work? Because they're incredibly simple, and I don't know, but now we've done it, they feel very, very obvious. Yeah. Which,
it's a lot of hard work to get to that point.
Yeah, and a lot of robust conversations. But it's really interesting how the simplest of questions can open up and really sort of release lots of potential, and like you say, a whole variety of ways you might get somewhere. Of course, Watershed are not the only people that are looking at this stuff. There's people looking at inclusion work and developing tools and methods to help with empathy, to help with designing, to help support better customer experiences, or just to get people to understand different cognitive approaches. Kent Council has a toolkit for schools, for example. Microsoft have their inclusive design tools. There's the amazing Unlimited and their card set. So there are, we're also producing these things in a rich space of lots of people also doing work, and it's totally unnecessary to reinvent the wheel as well. So part of this work points to them and what they do, because then we actually get to harness more energy and more thinking. So I've got one more question for you, Tony. What works for people? What are the best kinds of tools that you know that are out there?
So my favourite ones are the ones that deal with it really pragmatically, I think is probably the word that I use for it. Or ones that create space for honesty, which is what we're trying to do here, is kind of be honest with yourself about, I think the capacity one's a really interesting question for that, actually, around, well, do you have the space and the time, both professionally but also personally, for this? Have you got the headspace to try and create the change that you're trying to make? And actually, maybe now is not the time for what you're trying to do. And I think being able to be empowered to think about that in that kind of a way, I think is a really useful thing for people.
And if not now, then later.
Yes,
might be
yeah.
a relevant.
So that's not an excuse. It's not a
No.
reason to just cast it off and not think about it again. It's a part of your future plan, actually. Now's not the time, but then absolutely when, then, and kind of make sure that you keep it. Yes, so the other side of that is ones that create space for honesty and for realism around what it is that you're capable of achieving, but then also some real accountability to not just let yourself off the hook for it as well at the same time. I think ones that blend those two elements together, I think is really, really useful in this kind of a space.
And we know from experience it's not just enough to do the organisational actions. What do you recommend for people who are exploring on their own as they develop their understanding of where they're up to and what they can do?
I mean, it's not going to surprise you that my first protocol is to go and look at the toolkit, everybody. But then after that, I think it's like if what I'm saying is that everything is about thinking about your intentions and your audience, it's to go and interrogate those. Like, are you asking the right questions, and who are you asking them to? And go and talk to the people that you think that your work is for, and ask them really openly: does this work for you? And if it doesn't, be prepared to have that conversation to create the change that you need to make. It's one of those that people get really scared of it. I'm like, oh, it's just asking people if they're all right, I think, is this working for you? If not, why not? But also, if so, why so? It's really good to be able to learn from your successes as well. I think there's space in there for both of those things.
Brilliant. None of this work could have happened without Jazlyn Pinckey, who couldn't be here today. We should have had a third, empty chair
a cutout
for her. But her work has been very much about helping us to see out and to hone the way we think about stuff. And it's been a real delight to work with you and Jazz.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I think that is everything we wanted to say. So if there are any questions, we'll take whatever you've got.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It was really fascinating to hear. Also coming from Japan, where we have lots of work to do around like inclusivity, so it was really good to hear these perspectives. And I especially like the part where you mentioned about like inclusion is not a benchmark, but it's more like a balance. I was wondering, like, maybe can you elaborate more on like what is like I know it's not a benchmark thing, but what do you consider is like a good balance in these kind of things? Is it like statistical like representation balance, or like balance considering like historical power imbalances? Like, just wanted to know what's like sort of the good balance and how you define that.
That's a really great question, and it's one of the things that comes up. So when you do make grand statements like, oh, we don't work with benchmarks here, well, how do you then measure success? I guess you can't think of so the other side of the balance is the belonging element of it. And yes, it could be that you're trying to aim, to get general representation across all different elements, but it very much depends on the communities and the societies. Japan is a very different place to here. The demographics of the society are very different. So what balance might mean there will mean something different to what it is here. You could try and pin it to some statistics, but then it's what are the intentions that you're trying to serve as part of that. I guess it's a bunch of questions that I ask back to those. I don't know if that answers the question. So
But there is one of the things that's really come up is the role of data in being able to understand where you are, to be able to know where you are moving to, and that how critical that is. And I mean, almost discovering your own markers of what that progress is, because it might not just be numbers, or it might not be just proportions. It might be qualities of experience.
Well, that's what I was so sorry to explain myself out a little bit more. When we talk about belonging, so belonging, which is the other half of it, asks questions about how the people that are already inhabiting your space feel in that space. And actually, if the people that you're already engaging with are telling you that they don't feel that they can bring their whole selves into this organisation, or they don't feel that they can be their authentic selves, is language that comes out of the Balance and Belonging survey. Well, actually trying to bring a whole new bunch of people into that situation and into that setting could be creating harm. What you need to do is make sure that the cultures that the community that you're already serving and the culture that you're already creating works for the people that are already in that community before you consider trying to grow it out a little bit. And I think if you can help create those safe, warm, inviting environments, that the balance of an organisation, or a space or a community, kind of raises itself afterwards in lieu of that. I think it's the other way around.
I had a question about facilitation and how to facilitate without over-influencing. I work in arts and health, and I'm interested in giving a voice to people who have difficulty in even expressing themselves, let alone creating a visual film.
Yes.
Could you say something about facilitation?
Do you mean facilitation of in workshops, like physical settings?
How, as artists, we can enable people to create work that is new?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess it starts with a conversation around are you working with the same groups? Is it a regular group of people that you're working with? Are they?
Yeah.
And are you working with them over regular periods of time? But what I'm saying is, do we have space is there space in your processes to really work with them to build the support program that you need with them? My first thought is, work with them to understand what their needs are and then work backwards from there. Do you have the space and the time for that in your processes?
Time is limited with funding. We might have
so your resource is low and your capacity is low, but your power is high though then.
We might have 8 weeks to interview, engage, demonstrate, facilitate, make a film.
I guess it's having a really clear idea of, I'd say, what scaffolding you're putting in place first. So are there, without knowing your group, it's difficult, but absolutely you can go to people with a challenge of here's the pot of money that we've got, here's a camera, go and do it. And then there's another element of, well, here's some story chunks and blocks that you might want to bring in. It's about thinking about the scaffolding that you're building to facilitate. Is it about having a bunch of different routes in that people can self-select into those kinds of spaces? Do you create more than one offer of support? Don't put all your eggs in one basket of creating one offer of support. There has to be that first little bit of understanding what people need from the process that you put in.
I mean, another thing is that a really important resource when you're working with people who don't have a voice is time.
Yeah,
and actually maybe you won't do all of it in this time, but you will make sure, out of this you'll get more money to spend more time. It takes so long to build trust, and it's right that it takes so long, because people need to feel that your intentions are reflective of what they're trying to do. So sometimes you might only get part of the way with something like 8 weeks. That's all right, if that can be all right for you in terms of your project.
Do they have to have finished the film by the end of it? Are you expecting it to be of a certain length? I guess it's thinking about outputs in the way. So that's something that we talk about in the studio a lot, is this idea of process over product. And actually, is the important thing here that people have developed a really amazing film, or is the process of learning how to develop that film more important? The networks that they built and the confidence that they built in that space and the voice that they found in that space might not necessarily translate into, I think, even going into it going, right, we're going to make a film. I wonder if we're going to play with film becomes a different, is there a change in the invite? What's your intentions to them?
I was just going to build on that as well.
Yeah.
You might change the format of the film that makes it easier for people to contribute and less onerous. Yeah.
Look forward to it.
No.
Any other questions?
So the thing we'd love to say is try it out, play with it, use it, come back to us. on the end of the toolkit is a little survey that you can tell us what you think. These are our contacts, and you're really welcome to say hi and you know, tell us how you're getting on with it.
I've got a question, sorry,
Yes.
after you just did that bit. I noticed that in the framework and in your talk, there isn't a lot of time or space given to explaining kind of what you think inclusion is and why it's important in the world. And I was just wondering, is that an active choice to say, to decide that you're not in the business of persuading people, that, or was it not an active choice? I'm kind of interested in that setting aside of the why and focusing on the how. And
I think you can get really bogged down in the why sometimes, and actually trying to set and define what inclusion is becomes one of those chin-strokey ethereal conversations. And unless you're working in inclusion and want to come and, you know, and discuss the nuances of what inclusive practice is and how it works, people just want to be able to crack on with it, especially in the context of the framework and the teams that it was designed for with in mind. That's not a good sentence there, but actually people just want to crack on and be given an idea of where to start and what to do next and what to do later. And I think that's the design challenge that we were trying to tackle a little bit. So
and certainly from my point of view, if you're in the business of trying to persuade people, you can spend all your time doing that, and life is too short, and we need to, you know, I mean, I'm really happy to do that personally, but, you know, it felt like that was a distraction to actually, like, let's just make something that's going to work, because there is a level of understanding that it's really important. But to try and bring new people along who are resistant feels like that's a lot of work that was outside of our remit.
I think having that little space to go, do you want to be more inclusive? People go, well, we are being inclusive, but then if you can break that down into going, what are you doing, who are you doing it for, why is that the right thing to do for them? Asking people to articulate that, like I think it breaks it down in a way that makes you more accountable to the answer for it. And if you're struggling to answer those, then maybe you do need to stop and consider them more so than going, oh, we're fine in this space or in this organisation. Just make more complicated questions out of it.
okay. Thank you so much. I'm just going to say, before people head off, if you want to stick around and hot desk with us in the studio, you're very welcome to do so. Just find one of the studio team who are waving their hands, and we'll find a spot for you. If you're watching online, do drop us a line at studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions that you have. Next week, we will be joined by studio resident Tim Kinberg, who's going to be talking about his new product, Sust, which is a way of helping people to make more sustainable fashion choices. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you both for sharing your work.